And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and as we have discussed a number of times on this program, Social Security is in the news these days. There is a move to expand it. There is also an ongoing effort against it by the Republican Party. And here to give us some interesting background information on all of that is our next guest. Rebecca Vallas is Director of Policy at the Center for American Progress Talk Poverty team. She is also co-host of Talk Poverty Radio on Sirius XM Insight or SXM Insight, Saturdays at noon. And she is the leader of their Poverty to Prosperity team over there at CAP. Rebecca, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for promoting the show.
Oh, you bet. We try to do that for each other around here. So
we'll do the same for you our next episode.
It's a deal. Now, listen, you guys wrote a great piece, The Effect of Rising Inequality on Social Security. This is something that I and others have brought up, Dean Baker, different people, that that income inequality has caused a reduction in revenue to Social Security. So the answer to that, to the ongoing issue of Social Security, should involve a reduction in income inequality. But you put a lot of solid numbers behind that in your report, and which you co-authored. Tell us a little bit about what you concluded. I think it was an issue brief, technically. Tell us a little bit about what you concluded there.
Well, thank you so much for bringing me on to talk about this, RJ. So, we often hear a lot about rising inequality, and that's gotten a lot of attention. In fact, it seems to even be getting attention from Republicans these days. But what we hear a lot less about is the effect that rising income inequality is having on Social Security. And so that's what we wanted to take a look at in this issue brief. So what we did was we ran a couple of different what-if questions or simulations. So we took a look at, for starters, what if wage growth had kept pace over the last 30 years with productivity growth? Because something that your listeners are probably familiar with is that those in the middle and those at the bottom of the income ladder have really seen stagnant and even declining wages over the course of the last 3 decades, and particularly in the last 2. At the same time, productivity has basically doubled for those in the middle and at the bottom. So they're basically taking home less in their paychecks in real terms, while they're becoming twice as good at their jobs and increasing their output by a factor of 2. So that is one of the 2 primary trends that we've seen that has had a real impact on Social Security and on its financial health. So what we did to take a look at that first piece is we actually ran a simulation to say, what if wage growth had kept pace with productivity growth over the last 30 years? And the answer was really startling. The answer was, if that had happened, the Social Security trust funds would be more than $750 billion larger today. And that would obviously add years to Social Security's solvency. The second thing that we took a look at for this brief is we looked at the fact that more and more wages are escaping the payroll tax, and in particular, they're wages by people at the very top of the income ladder. So back in 1983, something called the Greenspan Commission, which was under then President Reagan, they set the payroll tax cap, which your listeners are probably familiar with because I know you talk about Social Security a lot. They set that payroll tax cap at 90% of wages. And so It was an intentional decision that 10% was going to be allowed to be exempt, but they wanted to capture 90%. Over time, what has happened is as the highest earners in the country have continued to take more and more of real income gains in this country, their wage growth has far outpaced your average earner. And because that payroll tax cap was indexed to average wage growth, that means it slipped over time. And so today, in 2015, the payroll tax cap, which is now at $118,500, it only captures 83% of wages compared to that 90% 30 years ago. So the second,
let's stop right here for a second, Rebecca, so we don't overwhelm our audience. So let's just make this real for people if we can. We're talking with Rebecca Vallas of the Center for American Progress about Social Security financing. So let's talk about this for a second. You looked at two things here. One is the way that productivity has soared. There's more output per working person, doubled, in fact, and yet that is not reflected in their income. Therefore, it's not reflected in their contributions to Social Security. So that starves Social Security money. Now, you looked at what would happen if it had kept pace, if their wages had kept pace with, in effect, the money that they are making for somebody. And you found that there would be $750 billion more in the Social Security trust funds. Now, I want people to understand, you know this, but I want our listeners to understand that's not a crazy idea. In fact, I believe the years were, I'm within a year or two anyway, 1948 and 1968, that's exactly what happened. Wages did keep pace with productivity, and those were some of our best years for economic growth, weren't they?
That's exactly right. And so no, it's far from a crazy thought. It's exactly what we would want to see as just a matter of course, and it's what would be better for middle class and lower income families.
And to your second point, Rebecca, which is, and I think your paper is very important. That's why I want to make sure that people understand it. To your second point, and I'm not saying you're doing a great job of communicating it, by the way. I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm just I always have that imaginary audience member who's, I want to speak to. The second piece is that Greenspan Commission, which was a bipartisan commission solving an urgent problem at the time, agreed that 90% of wages on principle should be contributing to this payroll tax that funds Social Security. And in fact, as you were pointing out, the enormous growth of very high-end income, that's capturing more of our national income, and therefore less of our national income is going into the system. And you found more than $1 trillion would be in the funds if that had not been the case, if we had kept those together. So where does this lead us in terms of concrete policy solutions?
So great question. So as you said, there are those two primary trends that we've seen that have really worsened Social Security's financial health for the long haul. I should say our findings actually come on top of estimates that the Social Security trustees have put out, which are really important, I think, for informing where do we go from here. And so what the Social Security trustees have estimated is that if we were to take that 90% figure and take the payroll tax cap and fix it at 90% now, moving forward, that one action on its own would close more than a quarter of Social Security's 75-year projected shortfall. And so that, I think, is a huge kind of neon light, or should be, around a very easy and common sense policy fix that should get bipartisan support. So that would be number one. I would say number two is, given the findings in our brief that inequality is really bad for Social Security, or the levels of inequality that we're seeing, policies that would reduce inequality and that would boost wage growth will thus, in turn, be good for Social Security. So things like raising the minimum wage, giving workers expanded voice in the workplace, and strengthening unions and collective bargaining, making sure that workers aren't misclassified as independent contractors. There's a whole litany of policy solutions that would be positive for boosting wages and would be good for working families. What we now see is that they would also be good for Social Security.
Now, you and I both, at least I had a period in my life as an analyst. You're speaking primarily as an analyst when we talk about this paper. So, but part of it, I'm also an advocate. You may consider yourself an advocate too. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but part of it, my concern here is that there's so much talk on the Republican side now about cutting Social Security, and their claim is that it's a sincere concern about the future viability of the program. that there's a part of me, you can comment however you wish or not at all, but there's a part of me that just wants to also use this not only because it's the right argument, but as a kind of jujitsu to say, well, if you're concerned about Social Security, help us fight inequality. If you're concerned about Social Security, let's manage that cap so that we're capturing 90% of wages again, as you suggested, or I would have other solutions potentially like lifting the cap. But whatever it is, there's a part of me that says both morally and rhetorically, shouldn't we be saying, well, we appreciate your concern in Social Security. Now show us you mean it by addressing these root problems.
I think that's exactly right. And I would take it one step further and say that, even outside of just the Social Security context, we've seen an increasing number, in fact, so many, it's almost giving me whiplash, of Republicans, many of them not just in leadership in the House and Senate, but also potential presidential hopefuls coming out and giving huge speeches on how much they care about inequality and poverty. I mean, just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen, a whole spate. Most recently, Jeb Bush giving a huge speech on the opportunity gap, McConnell, Boehner, Romney even. If they all care so much about inequality and poverty all of a sudden, I'm really interested in seeing them put their money where their mouth is, and this is one, easy way.
Absolutely. Now, let me ask you a quick question, Rebecca. Do you want to chat for a minute about poverty, too? Because I know your show is Talk Poverty, and I would love to ask you a couple questions about that, but I don't know your timing.
Happy to. Also happy to talk about DI, anything that works for you.
Okay, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we take a quick break? We'll be back with Rebecca Vallas of the Center for American Progress, and of the Talk Poverty radio show. So why don't we take a quick break and talk about a couple other things if you're game?
Great. Sounds good.
We will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour with Rebecca Vallas. Rebecca is Director of Policy at the Center for American Progress Talk Poverty team. She is also co-host of Talk Poverty Radio, which you can find Saturdays at noon on SXM Insight, Channel 121. Rebecca, before we went to break, we were talking about Social Security funding, but the issue du jour, which we can just talk about for a minute, is I would say, I don't know if you agree with this phrasing. Let me know. I would say the Republicans have manufactured a crisis over the Disability Insurance Trust Fund, because in the past, Congress 11 times has adjusted funds between disability and the retirement trust funds. Now they don't want to do it, and now they're saying they want to re-examine all of its funding. How big a deal is that? Just in a few words, how big a deal is that really?
And I would completely agree with your characterization, and it's what we're hearing increasingly from champions in the Senate, Social Security champions such as Sherrod Brown, Bernie Sanders, and others. They're all agreeing, and I think it's exactly right. Republicans are manufacturing a crisis here, and it's pretty clear what they're doing. They view the fact that we're coming up on 2016, which is a year when, as we've known for a long time, Congress is going to need to act to do basically what's been a routine fix for the last 50, 60 years. They've done it 11 times. It's something called rebalancing the trust funds. They have to do that periodically when there have been demographic shifts or other things that have put stress on one or the other trust fund. With the aging of the baby boomers and some other factors, we've seen some growth in the Social Security disability insurance program over the last 30 years that now rebalancing would address. And rebalancing would, as it has in the past, ensure that Social Security's entire system is able to continue to pay all promised benefits for the next 2 decades or close to it. Now, what we've seen is Republicans eyeing 2016 and that need for congressional action as really an opportunity to sort of use disability insurance as a backdoor into Social Security, which they would love to try to cut. And so what we've seen them doing is sort of taking step after step, starting with a midnight rule change that happened in January that Republicans forced through as part of the Republican rules package in the House. We're seeing them basically position all the chess pieces so that they can try and force cuts in Social Security and divide and conquer and pit seniors against people with disabilities in the process.
Or as we put it on this program, they're holding the disabled hostage in order to cut the entire program for an adjustment that, if I remember correctly, would amount to less than 1% of the entire retirement trust fund. So I think we're on the same page about that. Now, Rebecca Vallas, your show is called Talk Poverty. You're handling the Talk Poverty policy issues. Just in a couple minutes, it seems to me, for various reasons, we don't talk a lot anymore about poverty in this country. If I recall correctly, between 41 and 42 million Americans fall under the poverty guideline, 1 in 5 children. Why don't we talk about it more? Why don't we elevate that issue in the public mind?
I think, unfortunately, a lot of elected officials are really scared of the P word, of poverty. They think that somehow it's going to turn off voters. It's not what people identify with. The reality is that poverty is actually a mainstream experience. What I mean by that is that half of all Americans will experience at least a year of poverty at some point during their working years, and that number goes up to 4 out of 5 Americans if you count needing to turn to the safety net or needing to turn to unemployment insurance for at least a year. 4 out of 5. So the fact that I think a lot of people view poverty as an us and them issue is really misguided, and the reality is we should all be caring about creating and strengthening social insurance programs so that in case anything ever happens to us, whether it's job loss, whether it's injury or illness or a loved one getting sick, that we've got something there to protect us from the messy ups and downs of life, or as FDR called it, the hazards and vicissitudes of life.
You know, I think it's a fantastic point you make, Rebecca Vallas of the Center for American Progress. I think it's an important point you make about the fact that it is an issue that we will all at least brush up against. Most of us will brush up against in our lives. I think that's a terrific point. And the other thing, you may not know this offhand, but I think that the statistics show that many Americans are just 1 or 2 missed paychecks away from poverty themselves.
It's 1 in 3 Americans are basically a paycheck away, or a sick child, or a lost job away from poverty. That's exactly right.
So I guess I would ask you in conclusion, because, I'll say even on this show, I should probably talk a little bit more about poverty since so many people are affected by it. We can solve it, can't we?
So we actually can, and in the past we have. That's the thing most people, might not know. They might think of poverty as this intractable problem. The fact is, we have absolutely seen that when you enact the right public policies, when you make the right policy choices, you can dramatically reduce poverty, and we did it in LBJ's War on Poverty. I actually wrote a piece last year that I hope some of your listeners saw, which put out basically a 10-point agenda. It's by no means a comprehensive list, but it's 10 easy steps Congress can take to cut poverty, boost economic security, and expand the middle class. And it starts with creating jobs and investing in infrastructure to do that, raising the minimum.
Rebecca, did we lose you? Rebecca?
I'm still here if you can hear me.
No, you are still here. I'm sorry, you dropped off for a second. I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal with you if you're game. We will have you back on the show to talk about that, because I think it's very important for people, even if they lack the empathy in their own self-interest. I think people very much need to be aware of this issue, and I think our nation needs to address poverty. In the meantime, I want to thank you so much for joining us. We've been speaking with Rebecca Vallas of the Center for American Progress and the Talk Poverty radio program. Rebecca, thanks for being with us.
Happy to come back anytime. Thanks, RJ.
You bet. Now, in conclusion, folks, I just want to say this. Look, I've seen the polling. I know that it's hard for politicians to talk about poverty. They're afraid to do it on the Democratic side. They're afraid of being painted as liberal. On the Republican side, frankly, they have nothing to offer. So I get it. I know that they don't want to talk about it. I know that they don't want to bring the issue up. But the fact that we have an entire political party which is devoting its efforts, beginning in its very first day in control of the Senate, devoting its efforts to cutting Social Security, which represents an important safety net for Americans who get disabled and for Americans when they retire, is absolutely shameful. I've said it before, but I've said it again. We need better representation, and we need to be unashamed to be talking about these programs, defending them, and expanding them. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.